You are listening to the Roberta Glass True Crime Report, putting the true back in true crime. From New York City, Roberta Glass is now on the record.
All right, we are live. Hello, everybody. Happy Sunday. I hope you're having a fantastic day wherever you are. Beautiful day here in New York City. I wanted to talk today about the subject of innocence fraud, and I'm really happy to see other people address the issue, even if they aren't calling it innocence fraud. And one of the newest additions is the Tuesday Gazette Substack. She has thrown her hat into the ring to talk about wrongful convictions. I'm going to take a quick break. And when I come back, I'm going to read Tuesday's work, and we can talk a little bit about some of the things that I have to add, some things to add, and I have other things that I think need exploring and clarifying. So when I get back, we're going to be discussing Tuesday Gazette Substack on the wrongful conviction movement, making a murderer, and Adnan Syed. Stay tuned. If you are enjoying this episode of my True Crime Report, please hit the thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and share this episode. Get access to exclusive podcasts and other bonus content by becoming a patron today. If you have a question or comment for me, shoot me a super chat, and I'll do my best to answer it and read it on air. Thanks so much. Now back to the show. Okay, so the name of the article or the Substack, what do you call it? The piece is Marketing a Murderer. And yeah, they do market. I'm all the way at the bottom. You can see I was reading through it before the show. Marketing is one part of this movement. They have an extensive PR department, an in-house PR department is my understanding, and a lot of money to work with. But they also have very sympathetic journalists, mainstream journalists, who will just present their side of the story and won't bother ever reaching out to a prosecutor, reaching out to the victim's family. Neither of those things. The days of hearing both sides in our media seems to be a thing of the past. We have Fox News for one side of the story, and then we have, I'd say, MSNBC side of the story. And if you're on one side of the political spectrum, you're going to get your news from that side. And if you believe it other ways, you'll get it from the other side. So it begins. Marketing a murderer. The innocence movement has a dark side. Just ask Netflix and Bob Ruff. I would say that it's largely dark side. I don't know what they have had. Perhaps I haven't fully explored their great cases, but I'm sure they've had one or two good cases. But would we say if Bernie Madoff's victims made money, would we say that what Bernie Madoff did was good? He did some good. And you hear the same thing in stories about things like NXIVM. Nobody went into a cult like NXIVM and got and came out better than when they went in? And if so, and if there is someone like that, I haven't spoken to them, haven't seen them, or any kind of cult. So this is a criminal movement made up of lawyers. I would call it a mafia. It's an organized crime is what it is. But it's also at the same time a political lobbying movement where they're working to change the laws and get district attorneys elected who will do the bidding of this movement. And they come after very hard people who oppose them, which is why they're working so hard to press on in states that are really conservative. So it starts out, this new documentary, Convicting a Murderer, focuses on the vital details that viewers were not informed of in the original Netflix film, Making a Murderer. Although this new film, hosted by Candace Owens, focuses on correcting the biased narrative of the 2015 hit docuseries about Steven Avery, the broader intention is to point out how easily a misleading narrative can be pushed out into the masses, ultimately creating unnecessary havoc. So I would say the broader intention is to change our justice system so that they don't have to get out convicted killers. They can stop them from ever being prosecuted by putting in defendant-friendly prosecutors, by changing the laws to making the laws more defendant-friendly, to making it stacking the deck in the favor of the accused criminal. And I don't think and unfortunately, the point of convicting a murderer is these two women looking to do good fooled everybody. And the real issue is whether or not you believe Steven Avery is guilty, instead of what I see as the real major issue is that we have the biggest fraud in America, which I consider the wrongful conviction movement, running amok with no opposition and basically bullying everybody to get their way, because nobody wants to oppose a lawyer because they're so litigious. And they will go after you. Ask the people on Paul Cialino's lawsuit, and we'll talk about that a little later. So, yeah, I don't, unfortunately, yeah, Tuesday's correct that this is the point of creating a murderer, is to prove Steven Avery is guilty and say the doc is wrong. But had it been a more ambitious, deeper kind of documentary with some real punch, we really would have seen them exploring this movement, because Making a Murderer really is all about keeping the idea that Steven Avery is an exoneree, and keeping the idea that if he wasn't wrongfully convicted, he would have never killed Teresa Halbach. And I'm not on board with either of those ideas. Making a Murderer is a prime example of this. If you put a concerning story out there and create lots of media hype, the full truth is not needed to spark emotions and elicit reactions. It's actually quite alarming when you think about it. The reality is content is king in this modern world. Truth and transparency, meh, not so much. Yeah, content is king, but how many journalists out there are willing to cover the other side? Are willing to even say, in this case, Ken Kratz did a great job and really put on a good opposing media campaign. But where's the opposing media campaign to Serial? Where's the opposing media campaign to the West Memphis Three. There is none. This is a movement with no opposition, or one opposition, and you meaning me and maybe a couple other people like Martin Pribe. That's it. We're it. There isn't another podcaster that's talking about innocence fraud. They may be talking about guilt, but they're not talking about the fraud that built it. And I think that's a big problem. Who's brave enough to stand up and speak out? Not many. If you put a concerning story out there and lots of, okay, all right, I'm sorry, I'm going back. The wrongful conviction genre as a whole is a breeding ground for this type of deception and speculation in the media. Can't disagree there. It's a disheartening reality for those that are wrongfully convicted, because chances are the showboat advocates parading around with their microphones and angry voices are busy wasting time and resources by sensationalizing convicted felons as the victims. So I would say here, this is kind of confusing. So what she's saying is that there should be stories on people who are really wrongfully convicted and documentaries on really wrongfully convicted, not people who are pretending to be wrongfully convicted. The problem there is who's going to actually go through the court files and the transcripts and the appeals documents and suss out who's really rightfully convicted and wrongfully convicted. And I don't think these people who are actually the few people who were actually helped by this movement, who were wrongfully convicted, I don't think that they were hurt. Or are you talking about future people who might be wrongfully convicted? Nobody's going to believe them. I've heard that argument. Not my main concern. My main concern is people getting off, getting rich, perverting our justice system, and releasing really dangerous and deranged people. Bob Ruff, podcaster of the Truth and Justice podcast, is another great example of this. Ruff has been a controversial voice over the years with his crass crusader approach to promoting a narrative that includes dramatic storytelling while lacking in real clarity. Agree with you there. It sells more like a cheap tabloid than a well-researched analysis. Although he has chosen a case or two that is definitely worth advocating for. Really? What are those? Ruff, who claims to investigate with unbiased approach, has publicly promoted several convicted felons under a curated narrative. So if you're not familiar with Bob Ruff, originally when Serial came out, he was a big Adnan supporter. He started a podcast called Serial Dynasty. Then he got, my understanding is he got threatened with being sued for using the name Serial Dynasty. It was too close to Serial, so he changed his name to Truth and Justice podcast. And he works with places like the Texas Innocence Project. And it's very much like Jason Flom's Wrongly Convicted podcast. He does nothing but wrongful convictions. And what's interesting is I've never heard Bob Ruff being accused of being biased. But biased is, and why don't you take a case of a rightful conviction? But yet people on this side of the fence like me get that criticism all the time, that I should do wrongful conviction narratives. And I feel like saying, well, the entire world is doing them. All right. Although he has chosen a case or two. Okay. Just like the documentary Making a Murderer did with Stephen Avery, last season of Truth and Justice podcast, Bob's so-called unbiased approach looked questionable from the very beginning. During the year-long season, he had actually dined with the family of the convicted, accept donation money from them, gave loving shout-outs to them, and even allowed a family member to make concerning racial comments in his Truth and Justice Facebook group. I don't know anything about, I don't know what case she's talking about. On top of that, many people were muted and blocked from his social platforms for simply asking basic questions that were not so flattering for the convicted. That's happened all along in Bob Ruff's social media platforms. They either all his followers will gang up on you and attack you, or they'll boot you out. Ruff boasts about using a crowdsourcing investigation to seek the truth, but that crowd he sources from appears to be a very small and agreeable pond. A group of concerned listeners came together, me included, sharing questions over his confusing narrative, and were lucky enough to access the case files to fact check the information he shared. So my question to Tuesday is, did you do that with the cases that you consider are good that Bob Ruff is pushing? Did you find the case files and go through them? Because they all sound good on the surface, these stories. And that is just a mistake, is making Bob Ruff he is as the ultimate enemy of this movement. I know he's out there, he's a piece of it, but he's not one of the really super powerful players in this movement. And when Bob Ruff was going out there supporting Adnan Syed and accusing people in the case of murder, publicly, without much proof, or without what I would consider really strong evidence, or any strong evidence at all, he was generally praised and not criticized at all. I've only seen Bob Ruff come under criticism recently, but he's really a distraction. The big players are the lawyers who are moving this movement forward, and the lawyers who know it's going on and who are staying silent. The narrative shared by Ruff was discovered to be carefully crafted. Sorry about that. I just lost my place. I'm going to take a quick break and find my place, and I'll meet you on the other side of the break. I think it's a good time for it. Meet you on the other side of the break. If you are enjoying this episode of my True Crime Report, please hit the thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and share this episode. Get access to exclusive podcasts and other bonus content by becoming a patron today. If you have a question or comment for me, shoot me a super chat and I'll do my best to answer it and read it on air. Thanks so much. Now back to the show. Okay. The narrative shared by Ruff was discovered to be carefully crafted to make men seem much more innocent than the case files shows. It was like one long infomercial for the convicted. It included dramatic accusations of police corruption, crooked attorneys. Yeah, you should have stayed on that Tuesday. And feeble-minded jury members. Ruff refused to show newspaper clippings of the convicted criminal's history, and even deterred people from watching a police interview where the convicted men reassured one another in soft voices that they didn't tell them, the cops, anything. And when people approached him on this, he blocked and or muted them on his social platform. Hold on one second, guys. Whoop, my cat has been let out. Did you hear that meowing? He then tells his listeners that he is a victim of haters, quote unquote, who simply just hate him for no reason. While he shares these salty tears, he continues to sweep the bad parts of the narrative under his large rug while no one is looking. The real truth is, a narrative that these men are wrongfully convicted is a story that sells. Good point. And a mission to help them is so enticing for empathetic listeners. It makes them feel like they are a part of something good. Bob even refers to his fans as an army, which bolsters the sense of being on a mission to fight the evil injustices. Very insightful point. Even though Bob claims he is a neutral source of his investigation into cases, his action shows his true intent. Be the hero and prove that the convicted are victims of the judicial system. And this is the dark side of the innocent movement. Reminds me of the line in Postcards from the Edge. I'm not a box. I don't have sides. This is it. One side fits all. So I would say that's it really with this movement. One side fits all. It's all a dark side. Trying to sell a theory to the masses without full transparency, inciting emotions, refusing to admit errors, and lashing out on opposing opinions all seems to play a role in this concerning movement, and it creates havoc. And Netflix release of Making a Murderer, people were rushing over to sign petitions asking President Obama to pardon Stephen Avery from the murder of Teresa Halbach. Well, first of all, President Obama didn't have any power to pardon Stephen Avery. That was the real irony of that petition. Imagine the pain Teresa's family went through when her killer was being marketed as the victim. Yes, and they'll often, put out that the family members are really the real killer, because usually the family members think that the pet murderer of the wrongful conviction movement is guilty. So they becomes, like we've seen in the West Memphis 3 story, the grieving stepfathers become the real enemy, the real problem. And they re-victimize them all over again. It's not that they have an army of people who think he's guilty. They also have an army of people doxing them, harassing them. And I've never seen anyone in this movement say, back off, be respectful to the victim's family. It's truly heartbreaking. Knowing that they are well-meaning people out in the media trying to put a spotlight on a wrongful conviction backed up with real facts. Who are they? Who are these well-meaning people? And how do you know they're well-meaning? Makes it that much more difficult for them to be heard. The waters have been muddied. So I think what she's saying is this was a great movement, but now it's being spoiled. And I would say that this movement was co-started by Barry Schecht, who released O.J. Simpson, inspired by the O.J. Simpson case, where they fooled everyone into thinking that all this DNA was planted. I don't even know, or they hyped up racial tensions to get the verdict they wanted. It came out of a fraud itself. It was birthed out of a fraud. And I haven't seen all this great stuff it did. So, I obviously don't agree, but I think, and I think she's just waking up to this phenomenon now and doesn't know a whole lot about it. And I made the same mistakes in the beginning, because you see people like Bob Ruff and you think, especially at Serial, he actually did have some power. But compared to people like Steve Drisden and Lorna Ryder and Jennifer Bonjean, the lawyers who really work in this field and push it forward and have real power in this movement, he's really just a distraction. He's really just a symptom of the movement, and just capitalizing off of it. One grifter latches on to a grifter movement, in my opinion. And sadly, attempting to discern who those people are can be quite tricky for us listeners at times. Yes, I think that this Substack article proves that. The best thing you can do when consuming true crime is put on your critical thinking hats and research goggles before signing your name on a petition to pardon a felon. Well, what do you think you're going to find if you look up Anthony Porter or All Stories Science? You may find some critical articles. Well, let's say, is Stephen Avery guilty? Or the times the wrongful conviction, the times the Innocence Project was wrong. You're going to come up with a whole list of pro-Innocence Project articles. And if you're looking to look at a particular case and you're just looking at the media around the case, like the West Memphis 3, what do you think you're going to find? Do have some grace for those telling the story, but draw a line somewhere in the sand if the coverage is silencing honest questions from curious listeners. Why? Why should we have grace for those telling the story? Don't be afraid to listen to other perspectives. I mean, if they're going out there trying to, let's be honest about what their ultimate aim is. Their ultimate aim, I wouldn't think, is to have their listeners be complacent with the fact that a, quote, innocent man, unquote, is sitting in prison being wrongfully convicted. I would think that their ultimate aim is to make money and release this guy so that they can sue the state, sue whoever they want to sue, and get a big payout. There are two things going at the same time. Get the convicted killer out for ideological means, like it's this, even if he did do it, the system is corrupt, and he's done enough time. I think that's really the case with most of the people on the Adnan Syed side. And then there's the other side, which is I want to make as much money as I can from this story, from manipulating this story, from podcasts, from TV, TV, movies, documentaries, books. And that's why I would recommend Martin Pribe's book, Crooked City, or the documentary A Murder in the Park, so you can see what goes on behind the scenes. You can see the way people are promised things behind the scenes and how it all works. And how often we're not really getting the full story of these wrongful conviction tales. We just see the formerly convicted person walk out down the courtroom steps and has a press conference, and all their supporters are around them, and everyone's jubilant and excited, and the press mirrors that. Don't be afraid to listen to other perspectives and try not to hold firmly to one source for your own good, for your info. Well, if the one source were the court documents, I wouldn't have a problem with that. Don't let your emotions dictate the transcripts and facts. Good advice. Above all else, remember the only thing that honors the victims of a case is truth and transparency. Not sure if that's the only thing that can honor them, but okay. If the convicted is innocent, then the truth should be exposed. No curated stories needed. All right. So I'm going to take another quick break, and I'll be talking about Tuesday Gazette's work on the Adnan Syed case. When we come back, stay tuned. Talking about Tuesday Gazette Substack, the wrongful conviction movement, when we return. If you are enjoying this episode of my True Crime Report, please hit the thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and share this episode. Get access to exclusive podcasts and other bonus content by becoming a patron today. If you have a question or comment for me, shoot me a super chat and I'll do my best to answer it and read it on air. Thanks so much. Now back to the show. So the article that she wrote before this was The Adnan War That No One Asked For. And we get some of the kind of similar narrative. Ready or not, it started, and it's absolutely ridiculous, she writes. That's me saying she writes. Brett and Alice, hosts of the well-loved podcast The Prosecutors, have ruffled some sensitive feathers recently when releasing their own analysis of the Heyy case. The Harvard and Yale grad lawyers, nice, putting it a little appeal to authority there, use their podcast platform to analyze past and sometimes current cases and share their opinion of the, quote, whodunit mystery. In between lighthearted banter, Alice and Brett tell the storyline of a true crime case and then use an analytical approach to impart their own inference. The real drama came about when they chose the case of Heyy, sadly better known publicly as the Adnan Syed case, because he has been the center of the controversy for years. Good point. This media does obscure the victim. The story was first introduced by the award-winning podcast Serial and soon followed up by the Wrongful Conviction podcast Undisclosed and Serial Dynasty. Serial is hosted by an investigative journalist that rendered a well-intentioned, unbiased approach. Even the best journalists have some bias they must push aside, and Sarah Koenig handled this well. So I'm just curious where Adnan Syed's lawyer fits in to this, because apparently Justin Brown said to Adnan Syed that even before 1 minute of Serial was ever recorded, that Sarah Koenig would not be doing this if she didn't think you were innocent. And I'm just confused as to how she knows what Sarah Koenig's intentions are, and why she feels Serial was unbiased. It goes on, and I don't think I'm going to go through the whole thing because I don't think it's really necessary to say, well, Rabia Chaudhry had a problem with Serial, so I don't like Rabia Chaudhry. I think this is right. So I think that means that because it teed off, right, the supporters, because Serial angered the supporter, the advocate of the convicted killer, and he's still a convicted killer, don't forget that, then Sarah Koenig is well-intentioned and unbiased. She's unbiased, she says in one sentence, and then she says, well, all journalists have some bias. So it sounds like she's saying, well, she does have some bias, but that's just normal. But let's review. She totally obscured Heyy in Serial. She called her diary just like a typical teen diary, subtly demeaning her. She pushed aside and basically told the listener how to feel about the I want to kill note, that we should all feel that it's just nothing and blow it off because it's something you see in a cheesy detective novel. I could go on and on, but I would invite you instead to look at my Serial playlist and listen to what I've had to say when in real time, when Serial had come out, closer to when Serial had come out. I was very critical of Sarah Koenig for these very reasons. So I think that when you're just finding out about this phenomenon, this innocence fraud phenomenon, you want to believe that it's people like Rabia Chaudhry, it's sort of unlikable people like Bob Ruff and Rabia Chaudhry. They're the enemies, but the people like Sarah Koenig, who profited and made her career off of making, apologist pieces and promotional pieces for convicted killers, make her look like she's an unbiased, serious, fair journalist. I don't agree. But because she's so likable. And I do think that with Sarah Koenig's delivery, she can be very likable and relatable. But like my dad used to say, charm is the enemy of character. Where has she ever shown any real grit and character and stood up for Heyman Lee? I haven't seen it. Stood up for the truth. She's the one saying, I nursed doubt. I nursed doubt. And showing up on the courtroom steps when Adnan Syed was released from this fraud and not talking about it. That's the problem. And when Tuesday Gazette brings up that the prosecutor podcasts are Ivy League educated, there are many Ivy League educated lawyers who are pushing this movement forward. So many people have what we would consider the right credentials, appealing PR. And what they're doing is really atrocious. And it puts a good face on a really ugly, ugly, criminal, in my opinion, movement. But I'm glad to see, that people are starting to write about this and question this movement. But one of the ways that I know that this is a criminal movement is when really shady things are done, no one in the movement criticizes. They all join with what I would consider the fraudsters, like in the Adnan Syed case, celebrating, presenting it like a real case of innocence, that Adnan Syed didn't get let out because of one of these woke prosecutors who is basically another defense attorney. So we had two defense attorneys, one masquerading as a Marilyn Mosby, that's who I'm talking about, masquerading as a prosecutor, doing this fraud, in my opinion, in an in-camera meeting, which is the opposite of what it sounds like. It's a meeting with no court reporter, no cameras, in secret meeting is better description. On a Friday, and Adnan Syed's let out on a Monday, and everybody's ready to go. And when young Lee, Heyman Lee's brother, is horribly re-victimized and allowed to speak via Zoom, totally uninformed about what's going on, and told on a Friday, oh yeah, your sister's killer is going to be released on oh no, we're going to have a hearing for your sister's killer on Monday. You might want to watch via Zoom, not like you have a right to be there. When that happens, no one stands up and says that was really wrong. And not to mention the evidence that got out, Adnan Syed. Let's talk about that. DNA on the shoes of Heyman Lee that were in her car, not on her feet, in her car, the bottoms of her shoes. Really? Come on. And then another one was a statement from the wife of Adnan Syed's mentor, talking about talking about her husband, the mentor, talking about Adnan Syed's menacing, concerning behavior towards Heyman Lee before her murder. So one of the things that got Adnan Syed out was a description of Adnan Syed. And they're presenting that to the court as an alternative suspect. But just like Stephen Avery and Gregory Allen, it's not discussed. It's just rubber stamped by the DA. Evidence has never really gone through or argued over, examined, explored, just let out, rubber stamp. We can't get in the way of this PR exercise, this massive celebration, so we can finally sell Adnan Syed to the public as an innocent man. And look at what happened to, and the darkest moment of this movement was when happened in 1999 in Chicago, when an innocent all-story Simon was coerced into a false confession by a private detective hired by the Medial Innocence Project people, or working with the Medial Innocence Project class of journalist students who were solved crimes, reinvestigating Anthony Porter's conviction as he was on death row. And they used this false confession to get Anthony Porter off of death row, to end the death penalty in Chicago. Anthony Porter got out. Then all-story Simon got out with a statement from the judge saying, Anthony Porter did this. So what do you think happened to the journalist professor who taught it? Who spoke out and said that what he did was wrong in that case? Making deals to people to say things to support Anthony Porter getting out of death row. Who said that was wrong? And last I heard, he was leading the Illinois Innocence Project. So that is where I'm going to leave it today. Have a great weekend, everybody. And I'll see you back again here really soon. Have a good one, everybody.